Welcome back to the Dershow. Breaking news today. Obviously, Hunter Biden has been convicted of all counts, notwithstanding, a pretty good defense by Abby Lowell, who's his lawyer, who's a very good lawyer. I've worked with him in the past. I know his work, and I don't think there's much he could have done. The evidence was overwhelming. He was willing to plead guilty and get a plea bargain. The judge ultimately threw out the plea bargain because it wasn't clear how much it actually covered and whether it gave him immunity from other things. Because after all, the two charges against him, the tax charge and the gun charge, are really tips of a much, much deeper iceberg. The real question is, why did Hunter Biden get so much money for doing so little? Obviously, it was the use of his name. It's interesting because just the other day, I got asked by a lawyer to come into a case and just to basically appear and sign my name, and they would pay me a lot of money. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. If I become involved in a case, I have to be the lawyer. I'm not going to lend my name or rent my name or sell my name. And that's what obviously Hunter Biden has done. He's made a living off doing that. Having said that, I don't think he ever should have been charged with this crime involving the purchase of guns. People are generally not charged with this unless they then use the gun in a crime. The crimes that Hunter Biden was convicted of are generally called crimes of aggravation. If you're arrested for an armed robbery or an assault with a gun, they then add on to that the fact, but you got the gun improperly. It's very, very rare that people are charged with merely misstating something on the application. Generally, nobody knows whether you've misstated anything. How would anybody know whether you're an addict or not? It's only because you're the son of the president and you've written a book in which you acknowledge your addiction that this came out. By the way, the same thing is true of Donald Trump. Nobody's ever charged with the bookkeeping crimes that he was charged with. So what we have two cases of people being charged for crimes that they never would have been charged for if their names were Smith and Jones. And how many times have I said this? The Bible. Tomorrow is the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, tonight, actually, the holiday that recognizes the granting of the Torah to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. And right in the Torah, it says to judges, lo takir panim, don't recognize faces. To prosecutors, the same thing. Don't ever prosecute anybody because of who they are rather than what they have done. And, we hear so much about, no one's above the law. No one's above the law. No one's above the law, but the law is not what's in the statute books. There are statutes all over the place that people never get prosecuted for. Let me read you a quote from Justice Robert Jackson, the former Attorney General of the United States, probably the greatest lawyer in American history in terms of just lawyer, better than Abraham Lincoln, better than John Adams, and better than the current day lawyers. Robert Jackson was a really great lawyer. He was the chief prosecutor for the United States at Nuremberg and ultimately a justice of the United States Supreme Court. Here's what he said in a speech he made to prosecutors when he was the Attorney General. He said, with the law books filled with a great assortment of crimes, he said this in the 1940s, with the law books filed with a great assortment of crimes, there are even many more now, a prosecutor stands a fair chance of finding at least a technical violation of some act on the part of almost anybody. That means you. In such a case, it is not a question of discovering the commission of a crime and then looking for the man who committed it. It is a question of picking the man and then searching the law books or putting investigators to work to pin some offense on him. Obviously, that's what they did with Al Capone. Al Capone was, well known for being a mass murderer like Whitey Bulger. And eventually, they got Al Capone on tax violations, as they could, of course, get anybody. It was easy in this case because he was making fortunes of money off prostitution and gambling and other things and never reported any of that money. So his tax cases were directly related to his criminal conduct. And that's what Robert Jackson said. It was about the same time, it may have been slightly after the famous quote from Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, to Stalin, show me the man and I'll find you the crime. And that's, I think, what happened. It was a lot more complicated in the Hunter Biden case. In the Trump case, it's easy. They decided to get Trump, hence the name of my book, Get Trump. They set out to get Trump. Letitia James set out to get Trump. Alvin Bragg set out to get Trump. They then rummaged through all the law books, put dozens of lawyers onto it. Find a crime, find a crime. I promised to investigate and get Trump. I said I would do it. I'm going to lose for re-election unless you get Trump. Find something. Couldn't find anything. They couldn't find anything. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find anything. So they had to make it up. They had to take an expired misdemeanor, magically turn it into a viable felony, because maybe in his mind he was thinking possibly of using the payment he made to shut up the porn star as a tax deduction. You know, nuts. It's nuts. But that's what happened. So that was the clearest case of what Jackson warned against, searching through the statute books to find something. It's worse, because in the case of Donald Trump, they searched through the statute books and they couldn't find anything. So they constructed, made up, concocted a crime. I hope the appellate courts will see through that. In the Hunter Biden case, it was different. After all, the Democratic Justice Department was the one who decided to appoint a special counsel, special prosecutor, different names for different people, to investigate allegations against Hunter Biden. Actually, somewhat fairer. But nonetheless, they would never have gone after him. They would never have appointed a special counsel, a special prosecutor, unless they had to show that they were fair. So both the prosecution of Donald Trump and the appointment of a special prosecutor against Hunter Biden were designed to influence the election. In one case, to try to hurt a candidate in the election. In the other case of Hunter Biden, to avoid the accusation in the election that the Biden Justice Department didn't go after President Biden's son for political reasons. So they both were politically motivated, and they both reflect the recognition that the criminal justice system is being abused for partisan purposes. Even better example, of course, was the impeachment of Donald Trump on grounds that were not constitutionally permissible. Remember, the Constitution requires treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. They went after Trump for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. So the Republicans got even. They impeached Secretary Mayorkas for what? For having a policy on the border they disagreed with. There's no treason or bribery there. There are no high crimes and misdemeanors. And of course, the case was dropped by the Senate, and an acquittal was voted by the Senate in the Trump case. But we're seeing this weaponization on both sides. So I am calling for a ceasefire. All right, the score is now tied. 1 against Trump, 1 against Biden. An impeachment, 1 against Trump, 1 against Mayorkas. Score tied. The time has come to put this aside and stop using the criminal justice system as a weaponized tool against, in one case, your political opponents, and in another case, against the sacrificial lamb. And that's basically what Biden was. Everybody thought that he'd get a plea bargain and he'd walk away with a slap on the wrist. They didn't count on a judge saying, no, we're not going to allow this a plea bargain to go forward, because one thing that I think the Biden people feared is that the plea bargain didn't cover all of the allegations involving Ukraine and payments, and maybe there'd be investigations open. There still could be investigations by Congress. Excuse me. There's no prohibition against that. But what we're seeing again is just the complete weaponization, the complete distortion of the criminal justice system, the Constitution. And, as somebody who has tried so hard for 60 years to support and defend the Constitution, to see that the criminal justice system is applied neutrally and objectively, to see that no one's above the law, no one's below the law. You say no one's above the law, so Hunter Biden had to be prosecuted because he committed a crime. No, if no one is generally prosecuted for that, then he's below the law. Same thing is true with Trump. Even if you believe, and I don't see how you could believe, that Trump committed a viable crime not covered by the statute of limitations. By the way, I don't think he committed a crime. Even when expired under the statute of limitations, I don't think it was a misdemeanor to list as legal expenses or even retainer something that had to do with preventing, at least in part, a lawsuit. But even so, I mean, just the way in which our criminal justice system is being abused today, it's just not recognizable from the time I started practicing law. I know I sound like an old fogey. Back in the day, there were plenty of terrible things being done. Back in the day, there were Jim Crow laws. Back in the day, black people were being hanged for non-crimes, and white people were being acquitted by all-white juries for murders. I lived through Schwerner and Goodman and the others who were murdered. I read about Leo Frank. They were, the good old days weren't so good. But the politicization that has occurred in the last, 10 years or so, maybe it's a little longer, maybe it's a little less. Obviously, it's been exacerbated by what is correctly called, Trump syndrome. Trump creates such animosity and hatred and division that people are prepared to suspend the Constitution. I get emails every day from normally reasonable people, in one case, a relative, in other cases, friends, saying, we don't care about the Constitution. We just have to make sure Trump doesn't get elected, because if he gets elected, he'll destroy the Constitution. So the ends justify the means. No, they don't. Two constitutional wrongs do not a constitutional right make. And so I'm hoping maybe we'll get some sensible reaction to the Biden conviction. I've actually written an op-ed piece about this entitled Hunter Biden Conviction Shows That It's Time for a Ceasefire in the Weaponization of Criminal Justice. I doubt we're going to get that. I think the die has been cast. I think it's too late. I think we're going to see local prosecutors going after political figures on both sides. Look, we made the mistake back during the Jacksonian period of different Jackson, President Jackson, in the 1830s, Jacksonian democracy. As I've told you before, the United States was not a democracy until Jackson got elected. It was clearly a republic, and the people, very few people voted. A very tiny percentage of the population was eligible to vote. No women, no blacks. In some jurisdictions, no non-Christians. We didn't elect judges. We didn't elect prosecutors. It's absurd. Nobody would think about that. No country in the world elects judges and elects prosecutors except the United States. After Jacksonian democracy, we destroyed our legal system by creating a legal system that's not responsible to the rule of law or responsive to the rule of law, but responsive to the majority. It ceases to be a system of checks and balances when the two popular branches of the government, elected by popular vote or by electoral college vote, the executive branch and the legislative branch, the check is done by elected judges. Now, that's true not in the United States, and that's not true of the federal government. Their judges are appointed. But it is true in state courts, and in New York, judges are elected, and many of our states, judges are elected. Some cases, they're really just selected for election by political bosses. When I was growing up in New York, if you wanted to be a judge of the baseline Supreme Court of New York, it was very easy. You just contributed $10,000 to the local Democratic club, and you could be a judge. It's an expensive robe, a $10,000 robe. You didn't have to have any talent or ability or knowledge. If you just were a Democrat and you gave $10,000 to the local Democratic club, you could become a judge. You could also become a doctor. When I was growing up, if you contributed $10,000 to the campaign of a local congressman, he'd get you into downstate medical school. By the way, the same thing was true even for West Point. For West Point, people paid to get into West Point, made political contributions to get into West Point, the Coast Guard Academy, the Naval Academy. I hope those days are gone forever. Today, I don't think judgeships are decided by political contributions, but they are decided on political bases as well. But in New York, you run. You run. Maybe it's only every 14 years, but you still run. And you have to get nominated by your party. And prosecutors are elected every 2 years or 4 years, depending on the state and the jurisdiction. As I've said before, in Florida, unbelievably, the public defender gets elected, candidate A. Oh, I had Dershowitz's class in Constitution and Criminal Law. I know everything. I got an A+. If you elect me, I'll free every criminal. I'll get acquittals for all the murderers and rapists. He runs against candidate B. I flunked out of law school twice, passed, failed the bar. I don't know anything. If you elect me as public defender, all the defendants will be convicted. Who are you going to vote for? Who are you going to vote for? Are you going to really vote for a public defender who is so good that he'll free all the criminals? It's so absurd. Florida elects public defenders. It elects prosecutors. It elects judges. No. You shouldn't be willing to do that. But when you do that, you get results like you get in some of these cases. Remember, too, that in Delaware, the judge was not elected. It's an appointed judge, a federal judge. And that judge didn't have to fear being unelected. Don't know whether that judge will be promoted or demoted. You can't be demoted, but you can be promoted or not promoted based on the case. And of course, the decision whether to promote this judge will be made by Joe Biden and his Justice Department. The president gets to nominate sitting federal district court judges to the Court of Appeals. I do not think that this judge took that into consideration. The judge seemed quite fair in the way the instructions were given and the law was applied. And we'll see what happens at sentencing. I do not think there will be a prison sentence in either the Trump case or the Biden case, because neither of those cases should ever have been brought. And so here's my plea. Please, let's have a negotiated ceasefire. Let's sit down with leaders of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and let's agree to no longer use the criminal justice system as a way of going after our political enemies. It should start with the governor of New York giving a pardon to Donald Trump, which she's entitled to do, or have whoever it is that does the pardons in New York do that. The federal government can't do that. The president can't do it. And, Biden's going to have a hard time giving a pardon to his son. But if it's part of a negotiated resolution that both sides agree to pardons, maybe that's possible. But I don't think we're going to see any prison time. I think what we're seeing is Hunter Biden, unfortunately, being used as a sacrificial lamb to make it seem like justice is blind and justice is fair in the United States. Doesn't convince me, doesn't persuade me. So we'll keep watching the Justice Watch as we see if there are more and more injustices in the name of politics. Okay, let's turn to some letters. I don't know, before we get to the letters, some of the letters may deal with this. The Wall Street Journal, I mentioned it a bit yesterday, had an article confirming what I've been saying now for over 20 years, that the goal of Hamas, the purpose, the goal of Hamas is to see as many Gazan civilians killed as possible by Israel. That's their goal. They want to see dead Gazans. They want to see dead babies. They want to see dead children. They want to see dead women. I know it's cruel to say it, but that's not me. That's Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who said that. He was quoted. They found messages from him saying essentially that. We want martyrs. He allowed his own 2 children to die. And he didn't regret it, because they'll go to paradise and they'll get their 72 virgins. And Israel will be destroyed. They'll get all these demonstrations. Sinwar is prepared to allow thousands of Gazans to die in order to get demonstrations on college campuses. And the demonstrators have blood on their hands. The demonstrators are responsible for the death of the Gazans, because the reason the Gazans are being killed is to elicit the kinds of demonstrations that we're seeing on college campuses. So don't lecture me, you Hitler Youth, about what wonderful people you are. You're in favor of a ceasefire. By the way, you're not in favor of a ceasefire. Now that the Israelis have said, we agree to a ceasefire, the Egyptians have said, the Americans have said, the Qataris have said, President Biden has said the only thing standing between the ceasefire is Hamas. And have you heard a single demonstration? Last night, there were people demonstrating in New York, and before that, in Washington, D.C., and some of the demonstrators saying, kill 1,000 Zionists. That means 1,000 people like me and probably many like you, because anybody who believes that Israel has the right to exist as a Zionist, kill 1,000 Zionists. That means kill 1,000 Jews. And they were supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, murderous terrorist organizations. These are the Hitler Youth we're talking about. And I'm going to keep using the term Hitler Youth. I know I get criticized for it because some of you who criticize me, they're your children. Yeah, but Hitler Youth were children too. And Pol Pot Youth were children. And Castro Youth were children. And Stalin Youth were children. Youth is no excuse for supporting bigotry, murder, rape. And so I'm going to keep using the term Hitler Youth because if it fits, just use it. Okay, so here are some questions. Professor, have you identified any major mistakes Abby Lowell and the defense team made in the Hunter Biden case? The only mistake you could identify is going to trial. I think what he did was standard, what criminal defense lawyers do. He didn't put him on the witness stand. He seemed to cross-examine fairly effectively. He brought relatives of the Bidens to the courthouse. I remember when I was a law clerk, a friend of mine was the prosecutor in the Jimmy Hoffa case, and Ed Bennett Williams, a great lawyer, was representing Jimmy Hoffa, and he brought to the courthouse as his guest, sitting next to him, Joe Lewis, who was at that time the most famous African American in the country, and it was a predominantly African American jury, and Hoffa got acquitted. So I don't think he made any mistakes. Probably the plea bargain should have been accepted, certainly in retrospect. They should have done something to see if they could bring about the plea bargain. I think we'll see a plea bargain probably in the tax case. I don't see any percentage in getting a second conviction. So I think both sides will be amenable to a plea bargain in the tax case. We'll wait and see. Well, here's a question relating to that. Do you think if Abby Lowell had not been so greedy in the initial plea bargain negotiations that the trial may never have occurred? I don't think he was greedy. I think he was concerned that the plea bargain would keep the door open to much, much more serious charges, and that these charges were not sufficiently serious to warrant taking a risk that maybe there'd be serious charges. I don't think there would have been more serious charges, because I think if they could have been brought, they would have been brought by this time. Okay. This relates to Gaza. Children in a war zone can be intimidated into fighting actions they normally wouldn't. Had a friend who fought during the Vietnam War and said you couldn't trust kids because some were armed with grenades and would throw at American soldiers. As sad as these things happen during war, this happens in Gaza too. It's happened on the West Bank. We've seen children become suicide bombers. We've seen many, many women become suicide bombers. In fact, Hamas has a tactic. They get their terrorists to rape a woman, an innocent woman, to rape her. And in Hamas culture, if you're raped, horrible, but if you're raped, you're regarded as unmarriageable and a disgrace to the family. It's your fault, even if you were tied down by 10 men and brutally raped. It's your fault. And so the only way to redeem yourself is to blow yourself up as a suicide bomber. And there have been many instances where women have been raped and then coerced to save their family honor into being suicide bombers. So don't give me stuff about how many women have been killed. Women are terrorists if they belong to Hamas and if they blow up Israelis. So don't give me women. Give me terrorists and non-terrorists. Don't give me children who are 18. Give me terrorists and non-terrorists. Don't give me journalists. One of the people who were holding the hostage was a journalist, and he was killed. And good. Yes, that was one journalist I'd rather see dead than alive. Somebody who was using his home to harbor kidnapped hostages. So let's be careful about how we perceive things like children and women and civilians. Okay. Hold your nose if you must, but vote for Donald Trump in November. You're not going to persuade me. I'm going to make up my own mind. Donald Trump pointed to me explicitly, and he said people like Alan Dershowitz, who are Jewish supporters of Israel, would have to have their head examined if they voted for Biden. And I responded by saying, if my head were examined, you would find in it an open mind. And so I have an open mind. And I'm not going to be persuaded by you to hold my nose and vote for anybody. I can tell you one thing I won't do. I will not take into consideration the conviction in New York. That will not influence my vote one way or another. Professor Dershowitz, shouldn't a country prioritize their own civilian citizens over those who are not? Obviously, our southern border would indicate the administration does not. Look, of course, a country has the right to prioritize the lives of its own citizens. Otherwise, think of the implications. If Israel couldn't go and rescue 4 of its hostages, and we all hope they can rescue more, but if Israel couldn't go in to rescue 4 hostages because the fear is civilians will be killed because the hostages are held among civilians, it would mean that Israel could never rescue hostages. Because you're always, if Hamas hides the hostages in among civilians, you're always going to have to kill civilians. You try to minimize the number of civilians because you know that you lose every time a civilian dies, and Hamas wins every time Israel kills a civilian. So you do everything in your power to avoid civilian casualties, but it has to be done. Yes, you have to prioritize your own citizens, and I'm glad that 4 Israeli hostages were released. They were captured by Israel. They were rescued by Israel. Only CNN talked about them being released, suggesting that Hamas somehow had a change of heart. They had to retract that. Professor, the David Geffen UCLA Medical School was once ranked 6th in the nation and only accepted 300 out of 13,000 applicants. Since the adopting of DEI program, its ranking among medical schools has fallen to 18th. The number of students failing exams covering basic medical knowledge has increased tenfold. Does DEI now pose a legitimate threat to the welfare of the U.S. populace? Yes, it does. It poses a legitimate threat in every possible way, morally, economically, politically, constitutionally, in every way. DEI is a disaster. It's the enemy of meritocracy. If you want to be sure your doctors are meritocratically chosen, you want to make sure your pilots, your engineers are meritocratically chosen, oppose DEI, as I do, and have for 50 years. I was the only person on the Harvard Law School faculty to vote against race-based affirmative action in the early 1970s. I stood alone. I wrote an article for the Cardozo Law Review against race-based affirmative action. So I'm not new to this game. I've been following it for a long time. Professor, you have advocated an eye for an eye response to Hamas in regards to their attack on innocent civilians. No, I haven't at all. I've responded an eye of a terrorist, but not an eye for a civilian. The Democrats have tried to destroy Donald Trump and his family politically, financially, and criminally. Why would you find fault at them striking back at those who seek to harm them? Again, I don't have any problem with striking back at those who seek to harm them. Yes, I have no problem with going after Alfred Bragg and bringing bar charges against him because of his misuse of the criminal justice system. But I don't believe in going after innocent people just because they happen to be Democrats or they happen to be Republicans. So, yeah, I'm not in favor of tit for tat. I'm not in favor of an eye for an eye. I'm in favor of going after those like terrorists or like prosecutors who have abused their trust. That's my point of view. We'll talk more about that tomorrow.